A natural phenomenon occurs in knitting, and it creates a loose column of knit stitches. You'll see that these stitches below this garter line, these stitches here, are a bit looser and bigger in size than the ones here. And that is because the natural phenomenon is when transitioning from a purl to a knit stitch, these knit stitches seem just fine. But when you transition from a knit stitch to a purl stitch, this knit stitch can get kind of loose and wonky looking. Many knitters try to just knit that one really tight or try to correct that, but it doesn't usually help. And you'll see this often, it's especially problematic on the edges of cables where one side looks different from the other, or even on some ribbing. I don't use this technique that I'm going to show you every time I transition from a knit to a purl, but just in those like cable situations or color change where it becomes very obvious. So above this garter stitch line, I have worked this little technique that minimizes that looser stitch. So above here you can see that the first knit stitch and the last knit stitch and all of them in between are of a more consistent size. So let me show you my little trick. To minimize the looseness of this knit stitch before the purl stitch, we are actually going to do something different to this purl stitch. This is the one that will tighten up that knit stitch. So we're going to work our way to that stitch. I'm going to demonstrate the technique first for Western style knitters or people who throw their yarn, and then I'll show continental. So watch how Western style knitters purl. Yarn's in front and they wrap the yarn counterclockwise. That's the normal way of doing it. And I'm going to get to my knit stitches, and I'm just going to plain knit them, even though we think, oh my goodness, it's this last knit stitch we have to knit tightly. But you just go ahead and knit it as usual. So here's my last knit stitch, and there's my first purl stitch. So I'm going to knit that as usual. And now for this purl stitch, I'll bring my working yarn to the front. And you saw on the earlier purl stitches, we wrapped our yarn counterclockwise. Well, what we're going to be doing to minimize that loose knit stitches is we're going to enter the stitch as usual to purl. But instead of wrapping our yarn counterclockwise as we normally do, we're going to wrap our yarn clockwise. So that means the working yarn will come under the needle first and then over the top. And when I finish the stitch, you'll notice, I'm trying to situate it here for you, that it actually is twisted. The left leg is in front. Then I can continue to wrap the rest of them by wrapping them counterclockwise. It's just that first one that we have to wrap differently. So I'll show you that again. Go ahead and knit my knit stitches. Here I am at the last one. So for just this first purl stitch, I'm going to wrap my yarn clockwise. Under the needle and over the top. It results in a twisted stitch, and then I can just purl. Now, if I were going to purl continental, let me get my working yarn situated here. I would go ahead and have my working yarn in the front, enter my purl stitch, and my yarn comes through that way. Well, here's my stitch with the right leg in front, or untwisted. So now I'm going to go ahead and knit my knit stitches. Here is my last knit stitch. And now to purl this one clockwise, wrapping the yarn clockwise, continental, I'll put my needle into the stitch, but I'm going to bring the yarn, you can see I'm really sort of wrapping it clockwise. Let me do that again for you. Go into the stitch, yarn's in front, and kind of bring it under that way. So my new purl stitch has the yarn twisted. And then the rest of my stitches I can just purl as you normally would for continental knitting. So I'm going to get to the end of the row, and then I will show what we have to do a little bit differently on the wrong side. So here we are on the wrong side of our work. So we'll be knitting those stitches that we just purled. And you'll notice what happens when I get to this last knit stitch. This is the one that we wrapped clockwise instead of counterclockwise. It is twisted on the needle. When you get to that stitch that you did wrap clockwise, knit it through the back loop. This will untwist the stitch. It's now seated on the right hand needle correctly, and it will minimize that wonky stitch or the loose knit stitches. So let me get to one more time to show you. Work through these purl stitches. Work through the knit stitches. And here I am to the last knit stitch. You can see that it is seated incorrectly or twisted. So I will just knit that through the back loop to correct that. And that's my trick for minimizing loose knit columns. Happy knitting!